Hello and welcome to this online broadcast. My name is Jane Scarth and I'm the Curator of Public Programmes at the Whitechapel Gallery. Tonight's event marks the launch of the publication Revolutionary Feminisms, Conversations on Collective Action and Radical Thought. And I'm delighted that we're joined by the book's editors, Brenna Bhandar and Rafeef Ziadah, who are hosting the event in conversation with special guests Ruth Gilmore and Vron Ware. This event is situated as part of a series titled Feminist Resistance, Strategies for the 21st Century, in partnership with Verso as part of their 50th anniversary. Previous events in this series have included a talk with Brianne Fars and Lola Olufemi about the legacies of feminist manifestos, as well as the iconic Judith Butler and Amia Srinivasan in conversation. Recordings of both of these events are still available on the Whitechapel Gallery website and also our YouTube channel. The purpose of this series of events has been to investigate the ways feminist thinking and activism have developed and the tools that they provide us with for the 21st century struggles. There is a huge legacy of feminist work that we now draw on, but there are also many feminisms, plural, that shape how we can act. It's important to think about these diverse approaches, which so often become the basis for the work of artists involved in transformative politics. The ideas and issues that drive the work of so many contemporary artists, such as queerness, anti-colonialism, social justice, ecologies, all have intersecting feminist approaches that draw on many different legacies. And one of the artists currently on display at the Whitechapel Gallery is Nalini Malani, a pioneering artist from India who embodies the role of the artist as social activist in multi-layered immersive installations that cut across issues of violence, feminism, politics, racism, and post-colonial legacies. So it's in this context that we are honoured today to welcome 4 exceptional speakers and celebrate the publication that through new interviews hones in on ways in which Black, Indigenous, post-colonial and Marxian feminisms have created new ways of seeing, new theoretical frameworks for analysing political problems and new ways of relating to one another. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Of course, Ruth Gilmore, who is the Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences and American Studies at the Graduate Center of the City of University of New York, where she is also Director of the Center for Place, Culture and Politics. She is the author of Golden Gulag, Prison Surplus Crisis, and also Opposition in Globalizing California. Her honours include the American Studies Association Angela Y. Davis Award for Public Scholarship and the Association of American Geographers Harold Rose Award for Anti-Racist Research and Practice, among many others. Vron Ware is Professor of Sociology and Gender Studies at Kingston University and has worked as a journalist, a photographer, and an academic teaching cultural geography and sociology. She's the author of Beyond the Pale, White Women, Racism and History, and also Out of Whiteness, Colour, Politics and Culture. Brenna Bhandar is reader in Law and Cultural Theory at SOAS, University of London, and she's the author of Colonial Lives of Property, and she is also the co-editor of Plastic Materialities. Finally, Rafeef Ziadah is an academic, poet and activist currently teaching politics of the Middle East at SOAS, University of London. And she has worked as a researcher and campaigns organiser with a number of grassroots Palestinian, refugee rights and anti-poverty campaigns. Finally, to say the book is currently available on the Verso website at a steal at the discounted price of $10.79, and you can find a link for this in the chat shortly. So thank you to everyone for being here tonight, to our partners at Verso for working with us to programme this event, and of course a huge thanks to all of our speakers for sharing their thoughts and ideas with us this evening. So I'll hand over now to Brenna and Rafeef. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, for that very kind introduction, and thanks everybody tuning in to join us in these very busy, hectic times. We really appreciate you coming into this conversation. We wanted to keep this introduction very brief because what we're really interested in is the conversation around the book. And that's really my starting point in talking about the book, is that it is a set of conversations. And we really wanted to do that to go against the grain of very individualistic writing that happens or that we're pushed into within academia, to actually say that we would rather do a collective project and have a conversation with these authors that have had a major impact on our lives and on our ways of thinking and on our way of doing the activism that we do. So we structured it as a conversation to also account for changes that happen in people's thinking. Now, we would have never thought in a million years as we were working through the book that it would come out during a pandemic that has really highlighted the inequalities and the structural racism and the structural inequalities that we have all been living under for so long. It has really laid them bare in a way that I think has made revolutionary feminism so much more urgent to this current moment. So in a way, I am happy we are having these conversations because they're very fitting to all the social movements that are calling for real structural change at this time. The type of feminisms that are discussed in this book, while not all the authors and thinkers agree on every single point, there is a shared understanding of anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-racist feminism, but also one that is internationalist in scope and in mode. And actually, one of the refreshing things within all of the interviews is that people didn't have to agree on every single point, but there could be a joining around an overall politics that is calling for the types of change that most of us, or many of us that would be on this call, would like to see in the world today. Two interesting things I think that come out through the interviews and these conversations is the question of feminism itself and how it's portrayed. What are the absences? So if you take, Gender 101, usually you'll go through feminism, first wave, second wave, third wave, as if history happened in that linear way. And what is usually left out is that, women of color only emerge on the scene of feminism in third wave feminism, as if all of that activism did not happen and occur beforehand. So this book was very much about those legacies and that history that often gets forgotten or written out of the history of feminism until the third wave emerges. Also, because these conversations were happening across time, you could really see the circulation of ideas when it came to feminism itself. Legacies of anti-colonialism, legacies of anti-imperialism, internationalism, and how they really informed each other. It wasn't born in a single geography, but a really circulating geography across many different scales. The book itself does not deal with every type of feminism around the world in every single geography, because that would be impossible for any book to contain, but it certainly focuses on types of anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist feminism. Having said that, I think part of the joy of this project was not only the anti part, but also the part about the future and what we are for. So the final section is around abolition feminism, of course. And I think for me, it came very organically the way the book was structured, in that the final section is about abolition feminism, about that hope into the future and how we want to envision that future. So I'm very excited that today we have both Ruthie and Vron with us to have this conversation around the book. Thanks so much to Whitechapel Gallery, to Jane again for the kind introduction, and to Verso Press for giving us the space for this book. And I'll turn it over to Brenna to start the conversation.
Okay, thanks very much, Rafeef, for that introduction. Before I continue, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking from the unceded territory of the Lekwungen First Nation, whose historic relationship to this land continues into the present day. And beginning with this land acknowledgement feels necessary and vital, and it also links to the first question in a way that we would like to pose to Ruthie and Vron. So I'll just start with that. So we were struck by how, Vron, in your interview, you explain how empire reached into the villages of England as decolonization and anti-colonial struggles were taking place elsewhere, with the return of British colonial administrators to the UK. And your remarks really show how empire and colonialism saturated the UK beyond the urban sites that we normally focus on as the repositories of colonial wealth, and now as the location where the colonial archives are. So what of this history is written on the land outside of cities, beyond manorial estates, and how do colonial and post-colonial consciousnesses appear in rural areas? Ruthie, in your work, you challenge the rural-urban divide in other ways, and you refer to a Malay word, desa kota, which means neither urban nor rural, as a means of thinking of how people, migrants for instance, move through and inhabit multiple spaces, and how movement really supersedes this rural-urban binary, particularly when it comes to how we might imagine fighting racial capitalism. I think your point being that occupying, inhabiting, and moving through many different places creates a political space and space for a political consciousness that are not confined to a singular set of logics or formations, etc. So perhaps this first question might be to both of you, how you've reimagined the rural-urban divide, and what salience does that have in your work? How does landscape, really broadly conceived, so political landscape, intellectual landscape, material, figurative, appear in your work or in your current projects? So that's the first question we'd like to start with.
Shall I start?
Sure.
So first I'd like to say thank you to Brenna and Rafeef. Because of the pandemic, we haven't been able to say thank you and to celebrate together. So it was a huge honor to be included in this set of conversations. It's really wonderful. And of course, as Rafeef said, the kind of collective conversation that you're curating, if I can use that word, means that you are asking us in the interviews, in the question, when we sat down together, to really think with you about questions of sort of one's own formation, really, political formation. And I did write about the fact of growing up in a village and encountering a lot of people who'd fled from various colonies that were becoming independent, and Kenya, India, South Africa, and so on. But how I want to answer your question is not really about me or about my childhood and what I got from that, learning about the empire. Is really to question the whole sense of the rural as being outside, as being totally disconnected from a more metropolitan, modern life, really, and sensibility to these issues. So one of the things that I realized that happened is because the colonial imagination was infused with a sense of Englishness and what England was, that was really fostered and kind of prompted by forms of nostalgia, forms of culture, forms of writing, and other forms of representation in the late 19th century. So the idea of England as being this sort of unique and special place, marked very much by its rural qualities, was something that flourished in the Anglophone world and became less and less connected to what was actually happening on the ground in England. And I think this sense of England as being a kind of damaged space, of being predominantly white, as being very precious, as being totally unique in the whole world, this contributed to a sense of, well, it made a problem when the environmental movement began to organize, particularly from the sort of 1980s onwards, and tracking the language of the British conservation movement at that time, which is when I first began to be involved in environmental movements, or 70s and 80s. Again, it spoke to the sort of damage that had been done in England, or even in Britain, as something that was harmful to something that was totally unique and clearly integral to a sense of belonging to Britain. And there was no attempt to try and think outside that and to think about who was deciding who belonged and who didn't. What were the mechanisms that made people feel that they could never belong, even though they might have British citizenship? I suppose was thinking about the sense of that relationship to land and the representation of England has really only recently really begun to be challenged by young environmental activists, when there's been this huge realization that actually people are not only made to feel unwelcome or excluded or face hostility, people of color, in rural areas, which is another set of problems, but also in those movements themselves, there's been no attempt to speak to a younger generation in all its kind of complexity and multiplicity of backgrounds. So I think that's where I'm seeing the connection now, and that's what's really exciting, is the change that you can see happening in those forms of activism.
Great, thank you.
Well, why don't I pick up there and talk about another place that has an abiding myth of its uniqueness and specialness, which is the United States. A good deal of that land never ceded, and a good deal of it still suffering and continuing to suffer under environmental, racist, and capitalist super exploitation. Why don't I sort of proceed by talking a little bit about that neither urban nor rural that Brenna mentioned in the question, this concept of Desakota, which I learned actually while at a conference in Singapore, where people from all around the Pacific were discussing various ways of conceptualizing the production of space and the various, the multiple geographies that people live all the time. So thinking geography is not static and represented on maps with boundaries, but rather represented to and through how people's subjectivity interacts with structure in order to make and remake place and space. In the context of doing work, both research and political work, in rural California to try to stop the expansion of prisons there, one of the things that I and my comrades came across was how many of the contradictions that seem to be quote unquote urban really spread across the rural landscape, just as many of the contradictions that seem to be particularly not urban shaped urban dwellers' everyday experiences. And what brought a lot of people together was the organized violence that results in people being sent to prison. But what got me really interested in thinking Desakota was not only the urban-rural migrations, forced migrations of people sent to prisons and then their loved ones visiting them, but also the constant churn experienced by people who lived and worked mostly in the rural countryside in agriculture and resource extraction, who themselves were constantly in motion, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not, because of employment requirements or because they wanted to go home, wherever home might be, from work, wherever work might be. And that this set of dynamics put together gave me a way of thinking into the contradictions of the carceral state as it developed, of the decline in environmental protections, of long-distance migrants who work in agriculture, the rise of extractivism as the kind of model for economic activity. And it opened, therefore, a way for me to think about abolition as really centrally focused on one thing, which is to change everything, rather than to think about abolition as something that only adheres to we who worry about people who've been criminalized and sent to prison. So to take this a little bit further into what I've been thinking about lately, I'll start with a news item I read yesterday, which is the United States Army Corps of Engineers, which was established in 1790. It was one of the first forces established by the beginning of the United States as itself after the Revolution. The Army Corps of Engineers last week declined the request for a permit by a consortium of international mining concerns to mine for gold and copper in a part of Alaska that is simultaneously part of the United States, unceded territory, and still relatively pristine wilderness, where people who make their living from the land and from the waters have depended for years on maintaining that pristineness. And we know that mining gold and mining copper, however they're mined, whether underground or open pit, is a very energy intensive, climate change enhancing process. And yet, the urgency for copper has everything to do with the production of quote unquote green economies, and has everything to do with the fact that we're talking to each other across thousands and thousands and thousands of miles right now. So in thinking about that, I have been spending a lot of time, and I'll just leave this as a provocation, spending a lot of time trying to understand the work that all kinds of people do as abolition work, whatever they call it. So understand the work that, for example, people in the healthcare professions who are themselves very often long-distance migrants, wherever they might live and work at a moment, that work is abolition work. I think about the work of essential workers in general, particularly those who are out delivering and making and growing and caring for things and people, as abolition work, and ask myself how the forms of organization that people have engaged in is building from the essential perceptions that so many revolutionary feminists have had over time, whether or not, again, the workers who are organizing themselves think of themselves as abolitionists or feminists. And finally, what I think about in considering that refused permit to mine in Alaska is the fact that a global enterprise like Amazon gives us an opportunity to think about the various, quite literally, Pandora's boxes that are circulating the world, that if we open the box, whether the box contains a laptop or some food or something else, has concentrated in the box all of the contradictory relations that made that good possible to be produced and circulated, and that a firm like Amazon depends on, again, copper mining, cobalt, all of these minerals in order to be the, well, what a friend of mine who might be listening in now calls the cornucopia of capitalism. And then I think about the other Amazon, the place in Latin America where the rainforest is one of the lungs of the world, and where a good deal of the globe's diversity still exists, biological diversity. And I see that what feminism, various feminist traditions allow us to do is to think all the way into these relationships and all the way into these contradictions in order to pull out from the other side what some children of former migrant workers taught me some years ago, which is where life is precious, life is precious. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you both for engaging with that question and for giving us so much to think about. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question, which I'm sure in some ways will lead off from what some of what Ruthie was just talking about. And this question was circulating at the last sort of launch event that we did. And so there's a continuity for Rafeef and I, but I think for most people in the book as well, because it's about the idea of a conjunctural analysis as developed by Stuart Hall, which, has been very influential on a whole generation of scholars and scholar activists, or militant scholars in Ruthie's words. So we'd like to ask you, in your view, what it means to undertake a conjunctural analysis at this moment. How do you see the current conjuncture? So even just at the level of understanding or describing the current conjuncture, what kind of frameworks or concepts or ideas or practices do you find useful to understanding this present? And in thinking about how important a historical analysis is or history is to a conjunctural analysis, what particular trajectories of recent history do you feel are most important to turn our attention to in the current moment? So that's what we wanted to ask. Quite a broad question, but so I don't know if can we just stick with the same order? Vron, would you like to?
Well, I'll have a go at thinking about what you meant by that. I mean, I've been trying to cultivate a habit of ecological thought in which everything is connected to everything else. And in a way, Ruthie sort of outlined that just now. It's quite difficult to know where that takes you, because you can be simply sort of disabled by the enormity of the tasks that sort of face us. But I think that at the moment, I mean, it feels sort of excruciatingly like this is the last chance in thinking about the climate emergency, and everything we do has consequences for people in the global south, everything. And yet there's a promise that, people are coming together to discuss how to deal with the crisis that awaits us and has already swept over certain parts of the world. So in thinking, trying to use the sense of ecological thought and to connect particularly militarism, the rise of militarism, and to really focus on that, to think about the endless investment in new forms of arms. I mean, the UK government just announced this huge increase in arms expenditure or defence expenditure over the next period, which is really shocking. And the language that they used is all next generation. So they sort of posit a future that we may or may not have. And the future, we will be protected by these forms of weaponry that one can only imagine, sort of swarm drones and things. So I think that to counter this rise of militarism and this idea that one can depend on ever more advanced forms of technology using artificial intelligence and so on, is really terrifying. And that in itself is connected to the rise of racism and fascism, particularly different forms of far right, which also utilize this language of everything from sort of conspiracy about what happened in the past to the promise of technology and the use of the digital technologies. And in a way, it's easy to get lost trying to sort of think forward to how you connect all these different strands. And for me, it's important to return to some of the questions that we were thinking about just now. For example, the relationship between rural and urban. Do we want to abolish that particular distinction? How in terms of breaking these terms down, how might we think about what else we might have, how else we might configure these binaries? So to give you an example, Ruthie, when you were talking, I was thinking about, there's a lot of people on the sort of environmental movement who would like to actually abolish farming, that actually agriculture is pernicious and agriculture cannot be sustained because it relies on fertilizers which are linked to the arms industry. It has all kinds of problems built in, and actually it'd be much better if we ate microorganisms that can be made in a factory and we just let the land go. And I sort of want to engage with that because I don't honestly believe that is a sustainable future. And then you think about all the statistics about small farmers feeding the world and other parts of the globe and so on. And it's really important to try and focus and get a sense of perspective on what else is out there. That's quite hard work. That's really quite hard work. And so I'm just interested, Ruthie, when you were talking about sort of abolish everything, how you sort of pull back to a way of doing politics which isn't about just imagining and just imagining a kind of, or using language to kind of break things down. How do you give people a sense of what it is they might do that's connected to this sort of ecological way of connecting everything and restoring or doing away with? And what then do you actually do? Not in a practical sense, what organizations, but like how do you think about a way through these issues?
Well, I have to first be fair to myself. I've never said abolish everything. I'm not a nihilist. I said change everything, which is quite different. And I can change the water and keep the flowers, for example. That would be changing something. So it's like this, and this goes back all the way back to my understanding of conjunctural analysis, which, you know, I learned by reading Stuart Hall's work very carefully, and other people as well. And that is to think the analysis from what is at a kind of, even no matter how big my view is of the world and its interconnectedness, those analyses always start at a meso level where you can actually look at the ground and look at the air and look at the sky and think about the theoretical guide to action. That is the main thing I learned from reading Stuart Hall. That indeed, even the theorists that I learned about first, in some cases by reading Stuart Hall's work, were theorists who, in my head, in my, you know, kind of politically engaged, nerdly head, were theorists that to whom Stuart Hall was attracted because there was something about the objective conditions in which they were working through their thinking that helped him make sense of the conditions that he was trying to work through. Not to say that everything was the same, but there was enough there to work with. So now let me be more specific. Let's take the example of agriculture and farmers. So we know that a vast proportion of the arable land on Earth that is being used now for agriculture is controlled by a very small number of firms, very small number, just as so many other things on the planet are controlled that way. And yet, 70% of everything that eventually becomes our food is produced by small producers. Now, many of them are producing what they're producing to sell into the commodity chains for the large firms, but that doesn't mean it has to be that way. It means it is that way. So that is part of where change can come for changing everything. And an example of people who have, under conditions of extreme duress, achieved this kind of change in the conjuncture in which they live are certain formations within the MST in Brazil. So, as everybody knows, the MST, which is, to translate to English, Landless Workers Movement, do many things, including grow food. They are the largest producers of organic rice in Latin America. And because they use the principles of what I would call small c communism in the distribution of what they produce, they make this food available to people according to what those people can pay. So they're helping to feed people behind the blockade in Venezuela, people who are participating in long-term land occupations in South Africa, as well as throughout Latin America and beyond. So that's an example of change for change everything, where it seems to me that where our political imagination can go is into seeing how those changes have happened and understanding the theoretical and practical struggles for those changes and supporting them, but also seeing how the problem of land grabbing, which characterizes a good deal of the contemporary rounds of dispossession, land and water grabbing actually, in many parts of the world, have very sturdy organizations fighting against them that can join forces with other sturdy organizations. So just as, to a degree, some people working very hard for more than 25 years have managed to turn the tide of mass incarceration in a place like California, which was leading the planet. Similarly, people working in joint forces centered on the MST, but radiating around the global South and beyond, are managing a little bit to turn that tide. And that, to me, is what the work of abolition is. It's life in rehearsal. It's not like a full theorization of a utopia that's the day after tomorrow. It's life in rehearsal starting here and now. And that, I suppose, is what I learned from studying Stuart Hall and being friends with and a student of Vron Ware and Brenna Bhandar and Rafeef Ziadah and the other people who are participants in our wonderful book.
Thanks. Vron, did you have any follow-up comments or questions?
Well, I have been thinking a lot about farming, and actually I've been thinking very much about the soil. So I come at it through the basic sort of elements of what is actually happening and what's happened in the history of agriculture. So it's really interesting to hear Ruthie talking in a more sort of planetary way about how people relate to the land and organize themselves, and to kind of contrast that with a sense of what actually goes into the soil and how is that changing at local level in a country which has sort of pioneered the use of artificial fertilizers, and what sort of I don't want to use the word seed. What are the kind of sparks of change and resistance here that might speak to the other change elsewhere? Because for me, I suppose my sense of looking down at the ground and looking at the sky and thinking, well, where are you and how does this world put together, starts with where I am. And in a way, coming from a rural background, I found it useful to go back and really think that through and think, well, what was the what were the forces that were shaping that world that I grew up in? That kind of it wasn't a post-colonial world. It was a sort of slowly unraveling, decolonizing world, a sort of imperial world that didn't recognize itself as it was becoming post-imperial. And what was the role of, how did farming at that moment, in that time, how did that relate to those other political forces? So I'm sort of coming at it from a very different position. And so I really appreciate this chance to talk about these things, which I wouldn't normally think of as in a feminist discussion, to start launching into a thing about farming and soil and sort of productivity and organization like that. But I think it's really important, and it connects to the kind of resurgence of a kind of ecological consciousness or a sense of nature. The idea of nature is not something that can be left to the rural or left to the specialists or left to the people who've got a sort of thing about birds and or a thing about frogs or whatever. That actually the idea of nature is something that we just let go, to sort of ignore it and think it's not really something that concerns us. We don't do nature education in schools, for example. You don't learn about the birds around you. You don't know what the sounds are around you. You kind of lose that attentiveness to the world that we kind of grow up in. So there are things changing at that level, which I think are really important. And they speak to the imagination. They speak to the possibility of how we might live alongside and with other species. So I find that really encouraging, although it's quite slow. all the projects around making cities, making spaces in cities where kids can learn about the sort of natural world around them. And they don't have to go on a trip to the countryside to see that, because then they'd be completely alienated from that kind of space. So I guess that's what I've been thinking about. And sort of being part of this conversation has been helpful in kind of trying to move along. And yeah, I won't rabbit on, but that's what I was thinking.
No, I mean, I think this is interesting also to draw on an example that's more local to where I am right now, and trying to connect the very different sorts of ecological and also very different relationships to land and sustenance that Ruthie was pointing to. I mean, I think part of a movement to decolonize different settler colonial places like Canada do involve a very different form of education if you seek it out, starting with very young children, but also reaching all the way into the universities now. That has to do with understanding the land according to different First Nations epistemologies and relationships to land. So that requires a huge amount of unlearning and then relearning really how to see an environment that's become so familiar, a settler environment and landscape really that's become so naturalized, in one's view, really relearning how to see that space. So Vron, when you mentioned sort of even just being aware and connected to immediate things like the non-human life that surrounds us, even in a city environment, is really part of this movement, which I think is holds a lot of promise. And maybe part of this idea of unlearning and relearning and learning how to see the space that you're in very differently leads on to the last question that we wanted to pose, which has already come up in our discussion, which is about abolition. So in terms of the contact points between your work, you both draw inspiration from and also critical energy, if I can put it like that, by way of a counterfire to different movements for abolition. So from slavery and beyond, and movements for abolition that stretch back to different historical moments. So whether it be a focus on imperial war making or domestic policing, and both of you have interrogated and examined how these are linked. What are your thoughts on contemporary movements for abolition? And I also want to ask, what are your hesitations about contemporary discourses of abolition? And so that was the final question that we wanted to pose to you. So should we, yes, start with Ruthie?
Okay.
I just went, right. Yeah.
We'll reorganize. Well, I'll start with the end and work my way back. I have a lot of concern about contemporary discourses for not very profound reasons. Abolition has become an immensely popular word, and people are using it to say a whole lot of things. Many of which are, in my view, not particularly abolitionist, but what can you do? It's a word. That said, the heart of the matter, as far as I'm concerned, is to go back to what I said earlier, that in order to achieve abolition in the 21st century, we have to change one thing, which is everything. Abolition has to be green. Has to be. To be green, in my view, it has to be small c communist red. I don't see any way around it, and therefore it has to be internationalist. So those are the kind of three imperatives that I understand can unfold in a variety of ways. I've been working with a group of amazing people from North America, South Africa, and Europe, writing. They've done most of the writing. I just drop in from time to time to talk. Writing an internationalist abolition statement that sort of came to us as an idea when we had all gathered at a conference in Texas a little more than a year ago. And the purpose of that statement is really to lay out the thickness of what we see happening in the world around us. But the actual spark for the statement was when a young scholar, legal scholar called Zora Ahmed, who's also a practicing lawyer, gave a talk about the permanent war on terror, and was talking about the complexity of relations at the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, and how the war against the war on terror, which is to say the move to get rid of that war, does not just have two sides. The US funded or designed drones on the one hand, and then everybody on the ground on the other. There's all this stuff going on. And that put me in mind as I listened to her give a talk about the various things that I've learned over the years. For example, when I was in Palestine 30 years ago, and talking with and learning with people during the first Intifada about the struggle for liberation being a struggle not only to end the occupation, but to change relations on the ground for during the ending of the occupation and after the occupation, rather than abolition is merely the absence of one thing. And, I've written about this. So similarly in Du Bois, in Black Reconstruction in America, we see that what Du Bois lays out in that big, long book has to do with how abolition isn't just the absence of slavery, it was the presence of all the things that people were building, as well as the struggle that then was not able to reproduce itself very long, and yet we live with the legacies of that abolition of slavery, i.e. not striking a legal system from the books, but changing everything on the ground from what people already knew how to do, as well as what people learned how to do that was new. So I suppose, because we're running short on time, that I will pause and hear what Vron has to say, and maybe we'll go back and forth a little bit.
Well, I go back to the abolitionist movement time and time again. And actually, I was recently reading a eulogy that Frederick Douglass gave on the occasion of William Lloyd Garrison's death. And it's an extraordinary speech because they really fell out in quite interesting ways. And I was thinking about what it meant for him to give that speech in 1870, I think it was, looking back over a movement that had sort of turned into something else by necessity. And thinking about what that movement had meant during their lifetimes to which, they'd given their lives. So I sort of need to go back to that again and really think about what it means to kind of summon up a movement that's kind of over. It's kind of run its course. And life had moved on and people were involved in very different political struggles at that time. Anyway, my sort of connection to an abolitionist cause, I really think of the period in the 90s when some historians, and mainly historians in the United States, put together a kind of small, again, it wasn't even I wouldn't call it a movement, but it was a kind of tendency to abolish whiteness. And this was partly a kind of development of a body of historical work on the making of whiteness. I've just got to deal with my battery, which I've become a bit disconnected. Hang on a second. Okay, there we go. Anyway, I was invited to be part of this, and there was a journal. Some of you may remember it. It was called Race Traitor, and the slogan was "Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity," and it was a project as it came out of historical work, to think through how racial categories had been developed, how they'd been legitimized, how they'd been institutionalized and reified. And it was just the most wonderful thing, because it enabled the kind of intellectual and political work around whiteness, and the kind of revealing, the work that had to be done to reveal the formation of the whole concept of whiteness and its relationality to blackness and other forms of racial hierarchy. The idea to sort of do away with that, and then the whole pack of cards would fall down, sort of thing, was really fruitful. And then as time went by, I began to be a bit more sort of engaged with the ideas, because it was all happening in the United States. And if you talk to people in this country about abolishing whiteness, they just thought you were mad. It didn't have any sort of traction at all. Then certainly there was no sort of feminist interest in that project, either here or in the US, that I can remember. And actually the grounds on which I sort of gently tried to critique it in writing, in the book I wrote with Les Back, The Out of Whiteness, on the grounds that it was a kind of the kind of programmatic, the programmatic level of how to abolish whiteness was very much about sort of literally fighting the police on the street. So it had an element of a slight, how can I say, masculinist tone to violence on the street, sort of fighting back. And within the other sort of, within the language of the magazine and some of the other ideas, there wasn't really a deep thinking through about the kind of gendered implications of some of these ideas. So, and I think that it kind of, I won't say it fizzled out, but it didn't really sort of get taken up in a way that was creative or generative. But I do think about it a lot in my heart. I loved the idea of being part of something which had that vision, which had that sense of a sense of movement, really, and an end goal that wasn't just about saying, well, there's whiteness and blackness. Yes, they're relational, and you can make whiteness kind of purged of its racist content, and then we can all be good white people and get on with it. And, there was all that work was coming out, and it was just, it felt overwhelming. It was very hard to kind of raise your voice above that noise. So, and then more recently, being involved in a sort of anti-militarist politics, there are sort of periodic attempts to try and think about abolishing war as an institution. Just abolish war. It cannot happen again. We have to think of ways to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that, obviously is we don't hear much about that either. But again, it's about a process of thinking about what are the drivers of war, and returning back to what actually, not just the sort of historical thing of how wars happen, but what are the causes of conflict in the world. And again, it takes you into this world, as Ruthie was explaining, where you see these interconnections, you see these points at which conflicts are arising, that perhaps, that's where our energies should lie, rather than thinking about what happens when those conflicts do develop, and how to police them. Mm. So there's a very strong connections, I think, there with what Ruthie was saying.
Could I pick up a little bit?
Yeah, please.
Okay. And I really appreciate what you were talking about, Vron, and especially the distinction, as I understood you to make, between the kind of race traitor view of abolishing whiteness and the, we can just, fix things and make good white people out of bad white people and everything will be better. Which makes me think of something that I have been really profoundly concerned about lately, which is that however much something called white supremacy has shaped a good deal of everyday life for parts of the world, it's not the only problem in the world. And that people will carry on about white supremacy as though capitalism were not the problem, as though militarism were not a problem, as though climate change were not a problem, and as though something called white supremacy, if focused on and destroyed, would free everybody. And I don't see things that way. So I want to just say something, turn things around a little bit here. The first, it has to do with how many indigenous rights activists and others who are not necessarily in some views indigenous, but who have, as Clyde Woods teaches us, have become indigenous, such as the landless workers in Brazil and others, have been working very hard to realize what the organization called the Red Nation, which has been putting together really remarkable work. They're based in the Southwest US with a kind of pan-indigenous connection. The Red Nation is very keen on insisting that what they are for is a certain kind of stewardship of the land, rather than, say, a kind of Little England, we used to be the green and pleasant land sort view of the land, i.e. it's not a before, it's a later view of the world. So there's Nick Esdy's work, Laura Harjo, who's done 7th-generation planning, and others, thinking about the land, thinking about the soil, sort of lifting up the revolutionary possibilities embodied in somebody like Cabral, who was an agronomist. And I've learned from friends that a whole lot of people who have been, kind of key figures in revolutionary movements came to their consciousness by way of agronomy, which makes sense. It really does make sense. And also at the same time, to pick up on the point you were making, Vron, about abolish war, which again is where we who were working on this internationalist abolition statement started with Sorah Ahmed's work, is how profoundly US military strategy today, and the US is the military strong, bully of the world, that US military strategy today is based in the assumption that climate change is going to force people to move, and the US military's use of fossil fuels is one of the primary drivers of climate change. So we've got, the whole thing is encapsulated in the military itself. So if anybody wonders why militarism must be abolished, on top of the human sacrifice that results from endless war, there's also that the US military is designed to produce climate change and then police the people who are displaced because of climate change. So these are some of the, the ideas and the threads and the actual real struggles that people are engaged in on the ground, that I think that what we've been talking about today and the book that Rafeef and Brenna have put together give us some way of thinking about in a very dense and rich and, I think, productive manner.
There are a couple of questions coming from the audience, and given that we're almost out of time, I thought we could just take one question to finish off with, and we'll go a few minutes past the hour. And it's an interesting question about the meaning of the term revolutionary feminisms. So the question says, I wonder if any of the speakers can speak more to what constitutes revolutionary feminisms. What does the word revolutionary do, and what does it also take away, if anything? So maybe we can just conclude with this question with some thoughts around the meaning of revolutionary feminism. I'm not, Vron, would you like to?
I was going to ask you because it's your title.
I don't know. Maybe I can. I mean, I can. speak, maybe Rafeef and I can just respond then briefly. I mean, I think for us, and Rafeef, spoke about this when she introduced the book, but there are a lot of different kinds of feminism and strands of feminism included in amongst the interviewees. And I think for us, the meaning of revolutionary feminism is that regardless, in a way, of the differences between these different trajectories of feminist thought, all of our interviewees, whether this pertains to the indigenous feminism or the Marxian sort of third world feminism or the queer feminisms that Gary Kinsman writes about, they all are working towards a fundamental transformation and here the question of scale is very important. Fundamental transformation in relations at the level of the intimate and the domestic sphere, to the institutional sphere, to the sphere of the state, and then beyond. The term planetary came up, and that the kind of radical transformation that people are that the interviewees have been thinking about and working towards politically involve radical transformations at the level of the psyche, of the social, the cultural, the symbolic, etc. It really is change everything, to pick up on Ruthie's words. And I think the other aspect of why revolutionary feminisms came to our minds when we were thinking about a title for the collection is that the trajectories of feminism included in the book in some ways, reflect our own, trajectories as feminists and as militant scholars. With Rafeef and I, there's the work that's emanating from the settler colonial context of North America. There's the work emanating from the UK, informed by colonialism, anti-colonial struggle, and decolonization. There's work. It kind of reflected, I guess, the kinds of work that have been most impactful on our own thinking in a way. And not only our own thinking as individuals, but the communities of people that we've been a part of over the course of decades. So I guess that's how I would answer the question, but I'd like to hear Rafeef's answer.
And all I would add is we opened the book with a quote from Ella Baker about what it is to be radical, and it's the true meaning of the word radical is to look at the root. And what we saw in all of the interviews, once we put them all together, was that was really the thread that tied everyone's work together. Whether they were speaking about, the ecology, abolishing prisons, militarism, what we were all speaking about in the conversations was a real fundamental revolutionary change to turn the world upside down at the level of social relations, at the level of, a lot of the conversation today has been about everything because it is that mode of thinking of the totality, thinking about how we are interacting with the land, thinking about the extractives that we are using, thinking about the air that we breathe, but also our social relations that we have with each other. So for me, the thread that tied everyone in the book was not just writing about revolution, but actually also believing in that hope of revolution, which is quite, something in our day and age to still sustain a revolutionary feminism that talks about radical root change and still hold on to that hope of it happening collectively.
So I think, I just want to say thank you very much to Ruthie and Vron for helping us launch the book into the world, and also for giving so much time to the project in the first place, so generously, and also to say thank you to Rafeef, because it was a real pleasure, and also an honor to have such a wonderful collaboration together, which I think is also part of this sort of work. Yeah, so I think we can hand back to Jane if she's there, or Ralph. And thank you for everyone. I can't see who was here, but thank you for showing up to the event.